Our special guest speaker tonight is Dr. John Woodall. John was actually born in Wilmette, Illinois. I never met anyone who was actually born in Wilmette. I just thought we all end up there at some point. But that's very exciting. Let me read a little bit to you about this incredible gentleman. He is the founder and director of the Unity Project, which is preparing a generation of youth to be competent and compassionate citizens. No small task in that. He is co-founder of the Healing Arts Project, working with New York City's Department of Youth and Community Development to build resilient responses in children in the aftermath of 9/11. He is a board-certified psychiatrist with a special expertise in post-traumatic stress disorder. Dr. Woodall was the convener of the Resilient Responses to Social Crisis Working Group at Harvard University's Mind-Brain Behavior Initiative and a research fellow at the Judge Baker Children's Center at the Harvard Medical School. His area of interest is building cohesive communities in the aftermath of conflict. He has consulted with a number of government agencies, the United Nations, universities, and international non-governmental organizations on issues of community building and interethnic reconciliation in the United States, Europe, Central America, the Middle East, and Cyprus, and the Balkans too. Has have quite a passport. He provided consultation to Congress on the creation of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. He was director of a USAID fund refugee effort in Croatia that was organized through the Harvard School of Public Health and has continued with interethnic coalition building efforts in Bosnia and the Middle East. And he has found in his spare time some time to come down here from Boston, Massachusetts, and speak with us. We are delighted to welcome Dr. John Woodall.
Well, friends, it's really great to be here. Susan and Michael were very gracious in inviting me down here. We had a chance to meet at the Llewellyn Baha'i School this summer. And, you know, it's the experience you have as a Baha'i when you go to a new town and you haven't met the Baha'is yet. It makes no difference. It's as if you're coming home. It's something that happens over and over again. And after a while, you just come to excitedly anticipate meeting your family in another town, people you haven't met before. But it's that same open acceptance, that same loving embrace, that same assumption that we've always known each other and we always will. And that's absolutely been my experience here since I got here. And I'm just very grateful to the Baha'i community of Clearwater for having me come. And but it's more than Clearwater, isn't it? Your cluster is Pinellas County, is that what you, okay, very good. Well, friends, I deliberately didn't make notes of a formal kind to present to you because this kind of work is very personal, and it's also very, very touching and close to the heart. So I always feel a little awkward talking about these sorts of experiences in large settings, only for the reason that I want to be able to honestly convey what I've had the privilege of observing for many years as a clinician, and that is the inherent dignity and nobility of the human soul. You know, when you sit with someone as a psychiatrist, and they're telling you something about an intimate struggle, something that maybe only they know about, something maybe they've been struggling with not just for days or weeks or months, but years. And it may be that there will be no relief from the thing that they're suffering from. And that there's no way to ultimately change the condition that they're facing. And yet you see a kind of nobility and courage, a patience and a perseverance, a vulnerable compassion that the person brings to their situation, it can only make you feel a deeply felt sense of compassion and honor, and again, the privilege that I have of being in that situation, but also a conviction of the nobility of the soul, that there is something in us that comes out at these deep moments. And I know for me it's had a tremendous effect on the growth of my own faith, because it moved my faith from a level of kind of a statements of belief, and has turned it into something of a witnessed experience of again, this nobility of our soul. Baha'u'llah says that man is the supreme talisman, and that possessed of gems, he has a mind rich in gems of inestimable value. And when you see those gems come out in the midst of what might be considered unbearable suffering, you have a very powerful tool then to face the difficulties that life presents. So that's all prelude to say what I'd like to say next. We didn't make up the rules for this life. You know, if I had my way, suffering wouldn't have been a part of the game plan for life. It wouldn't have been something that I would have thought would be part of the way I would have unfolded life. And it seems to me most of what happens to us in life, most of who we become, is really our response to travail, our response to difficulties. And we live in a culture that not only minimizes our struggle with difficulties, but it says that if you're struggling, some way you're deficient, you know. If you're not, abundantly wealthy and abundantly happy and blissful at all times, and if you're not abundantly successful in all your relationships, you've fundamentally failed. And there's a whole stacks of books in bookstores that will tell you, in one way or another, that you haven't mastered the 7 principles of this or the 10 principles of that, so that they can sell you more things. So our suffering has become a commodity in this culture and minimized, and we are made to feel in some ways that we're inadequate if we go through what every human being must, and that is make it from birth to our death with some degree of nobility. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to tell you a story. And this was something that a 6-year-old boy and a 14-year-old boy taught me when I was the second time I went to a town called Karlovac, which is in Croatia. Remember the war in Yugoslavia, in the early part of the 90s? I was sent over by the United Nations in 1992, just when the war, a few weeks after the war in Bosnia began, and there were floods of refugees coming across the border of Bosnia into occupied Croatia and then into Croatia itself. And when I first arrived in this town of Karlovac, people were literally showing up in the streets of this town with whatever possessions they could carry in their arms, not even in suitcases. It's like as if they had grabbed something off, the bureau at home or off a bed or reached into a closet and literally ran with things and didn't have a chance to pack even. And they had been running that way for, let's say, 10, 20 miles, maybe 2 hours before I saw them or 3 hours before I saw them. And there were no refugee camps because this was happening right in real time. So a few months later, I was back again with an organization called Physicians for Human Rights, and we were documenting war crimes at the time because we had found on this first trip that, do you remember these horrible stories about these rape camps? We don't have to go into that, some of the stories behind that, but I was seeing these women and couldn't figure out what was going on with them. They'd be crying and weeping and wailing in one minute and then catatonically unresponsive the next. I thought, what is happening here? And the children the same way. Well, these women had been brutalized in all kinds of ways, as had the children. Many of the men weren't there because they had been killed. So months later now, we had organized ourselves to go and collect data to be used for what was then the International War Crimes Commission, to try to find ways to bring legal pressures on the Serb government at that time and make a case for prosecution of war crimes. But at any rate, I went with a good colleague of mine, a psychiatrist from Croatia who obviously speaks the language. And we went to this barracks. It's a 6-story barracks, and each of the stories of the barracks had 4 large rooms, actually about this size. And the rooms were from floor to ceiling bunks. So there were 3 level bunks. And one side of the room was where the women stayed, and the other side is where the men stayed. And they had strung a string and thrown blankets and things over to make a divider. So I explained to the men, the women weren't amenable to speaking, and in the culture, it was the men who did the speaking. So I told them why I was there, to do what we could to try to bring a case on their behalf to the United Nations and to the War Crimes Commission, and if they'd be willing to talk, I'd be happy to record their stories. So we went through this process for 3-4 hours of recording in great detail as much as we could about the experience of these people, and we had it on tape, and we were also transcribing. And as we were talking, I remember looking at a large group of children who had come to listen as well, and I thought, oh my God, these poor kids are hearing these terrible stories. And I thought, I really ought to get them out of the room because they shouldn't be hearing this. And then I thought, who are you kidding? This is their story. It's not something they didn't experience also. So that changed my whole notion of, well, they probably should be here because they haven't had a chance to really figure out what's been happening to them. Well, we went through this whole process, and as the time went on, I kept thinking, I need to do something with these kids. You know, I was there kind of as a rapporteur to collect data, but I thought as a clinician, I can't leave these kids without some kind of intervention. So I thought, okay, I wasn't quite sure what I was going to do, but I knew I would. Well, actually, it's something we did with Michael and Susan's kids this morning. There's always you can always start with magic. So actually, I need a volunteer. I need a volunteer under the age of 15. Okay, here we go. So when I also need a volunteer around the age of 6 or 7. I'll take a 7-year-old. 8 is good. someone who's never matured past about 9 but is maybe 50. Okay. Hi, what's your name? What's your name?
Mateen.
Thank you, Mateen, for very courageous. Thanks you for coming up. And Mateen, you're going to have to stand there just for a little bit because I'm going to work this in a little bit. Now, I need a hand, but let me see if I can pull this off. What I did is I noticed that the kids were very intent. You know, Mateen, let's do this so you don't have to stand and feel uncomfortable. I'll call you up in just a minute. Would you mind sitting right there, though? Great, thank you, Mateen. Did you volunteer or did you get volunteered? You did? Okay, good. All right. So there was this one little boy about 6 years old, and I asked him his name. His name was Branimir. And I handed out to Branimir some paper and crayons. And I said, Branimir, I want you to hand this paper and these crayons out to all the other kids, and I want you guys to draw a picture of your house and or your home, and just to kind of get a sense of where the kids were. And so and I said, here's the rules, Branimir, and this is what you have to tell all the other kids. The rules are you can only have 3 crayons. If you need another color, you have to ask, and there's no hitting. Okay. So Branimir, so he took the paper and the crayons and he handed them out to the other kids, and these big 14, 15-year-old kids were trying to steal paper from him, and he was like, "No, you only get 3, and you only get 1 piece of paper." He was really he was a good little leader at 6 years old. So, and he wasn't going to be pushed around by these big kids, and they kind of recoiled and got in line. So the kids were drawing these pictures of these horror scenes of planes strafing their homes, and I don't have to tell you the stories. It's gratuitous to tell you, but they weren't very pretty. So now I was thinking, there's a saying in mental health care is that don't open something you can't close. So if you open this, you better stick around and close it, because you can't disturb these children like that and then walk away. So I thought, okay, now I have to do some magic. Mateen, that's your cue. So what I did is I said, okay, Branimir, come here. I said, you know, I'm pretty sure, Branimir, the way you handled that you've got a lot of magic. Pretty sure, because you look like a child who's got a lot of magic. Do you think you have magic? And he's looking at me like, what's wrong with you? And I said, no, I'm pretty sure you have magic. And he said, are you sure? I said, yeah. So, okay, would you hold that, Mateen? So I said, okay, let's try this. So I said, first of all, 6-year-olds have magic. And if you rub on them with a coin, you can get the magic onto the coin. So I said, okay, Branimir, blow on. See? And then, of course, pulled it out of his ear. So he said, how did you do that? He said, do that again. So I said, okay, you can go sit down now. I just needed an ear. So I said, well, he said, do that again. So all the other kids came over and they wanted me to do it. So what I did is put the coin in my hand and had them all blow, and it didn't go away. It was in my hand. It stayed in my hand. And I said, well, what's the problem here? How come it didn't go away? And this little girl said, you didn't rub it on our tummies. You didn't get our magic. I said, oh, of course. So this time I rubbed all of their stomachs, and it was pretty much all of the kids in the room. And then now we blew, and the coin was still there. I said, well, wait a minute. We rubbed it on your stomachs, but how come it didn't go away? And the same little girl said, there's a baby on the other end. You forgot the baby. So we ran across to the other end of the room, and there was this older woman holding this little infant. And I asked this lady, was it okay if I rubbed? I'm sure they thought this was nuts, but I asked if it was all right to get the baby's magic, and she said, oh, sure, go ahead. So she lifted up the baby's gown, and I rubbed on the stomach, and we all excitedly ran back. And then this time, when we blew, the coin was gone. And we looked everywhere for it, because that was a lot of magic. There was a lot of kids, a lot of magic, and so that we couldn't find the ring anywhere. Looking in all the kids' ears, and they're looking in each other's pants, and they're looking down each other's shirts, and there's just no coin anywhere. So I thought, I know where it is. So we ran back over to the lady with the little baby, and of course it was in the lady's ear. So that was just too funny. Now I had the kids' attention. So we came back, and I said, wow, you guys really taught me something really important. You guys have a lot of magic when you work together. Because it was almost, we didn't have any magic when it was most of you, but we had all of you. We had this incredible magic. And they said, yeah, just do the trick again. I said, no, listen to me. Think about it. You guys, you didn't know you had that magic, but when you all worked together like that, something really amazing happened. I wonder if you could use that kind of magic to make anything happen. Just do the trick again. No, and I'm thinking, okay, you can't preach too long to kids. So I'm thinking, well, what if you use that magic to make peace? What if you use that magic to rebuild your families and go, when you go back home? Isn't it? Just do the magic trick. But once I was talking about their suffering a little bit, talking about the magic in relation to that, they were a little more hesitant. I said, well, just think about this. You could be really important magicians in the world if you could show people how to work together and make peace. That would be really important. This 14-year-old boy in a bunk over to the side of me, he says, I want the magic to kill all the Chetniks. Well, the Chetniks was the name they gave to the Serb soldiers who had driven them out of their houses, committed all these atrocities, and killed their families and robbed them of their belongings and sent them in the middle of winter to this fate. When he said that, the room just became dead, just deadly silent, and kids, adults, everyone is looking at me. So I thought, okay, this is it. For me, the issue of even going there was, you can say you believe in the light and you believe in human unity and the nobility of the human soul, but if you if it's not tested, it's just a slogan. It's a bumper sticker. It's worthless. So this was my way of challenging myself, in a way, by going there. So here it was. This was the bottom line. Now what are you going to do? So I thought, oh boy. Is it on? Okay. So I said, who better than you could tell the rest of the world what peace is, or how valuable peace is? If you say it after what you've been through, people will listen. You are children, and you are more authorities about peace than I am because of what you've gone through. And people will listen to you. They won't listen to me. And he looked at me and he said, well, what if they come into our village with guns? Thanks, Susan. They had come into their villages with guns. He wasn't arguing with me. He was trying to find a real answer to the crisis that he was in. I said, and then I tried it again. I said, but think of it. Look around this room. Look at the suffering in this room. Look what you've been through. If you don't find a way to make peace from this, this kind of problem will never end. It will just keep going on. You could be the one that does something that your fathers and your grandfathers were not able to do. You could make peace. But what if they come into our houses with knives? They did come into their houses with knives. And I thought, you know, this child doesn't need an intellectual answer. He's not looking for a theoretical principle. I thought he needed a different kind of answer. He didn't need an intellectual answer. He needed an answer that addressed the situation he was in. He was afraid. He was tired. He was confused. He was overwhelmed. So I said to him that the first principle of therapy is, unless a person feels safe and that they can trust that they'll stay safe, they're not going to open up. They're going to necessarily protect themselves. That's what people do. We protect ourselves when we feel threatened. So all the intellectualization in the world is not going to help him until he feels safe. And he wasn't safe. So that's what I said. I said, you know, it makes sense to me right now that you have these important questions. But there'll come a time when you're out of this room, when you're somewhere safe, when you'll be warm, and you'll be with the people that you love, and you'll feel safe. And a time will come when you feel safe, when you'll be able to think back on this terrible time, and you'll be able to make a choice. You'll be able to say to yourself that you would like peace for yourself and for your family and for everyone. Thank you. But you don't have to make that choice now. You can wait. And I thought that's about the best I thought I could do at that point. And I just thought too much is a bad thing, so I stopped. And the room was silent. All the little kids were silent, and they didn't really know. I could see there was a lot going on. And this young man was brooding, and I didn't know what to do next. So about a minute went by, and all of a sudden, this young man bolted up from the bed, and he put his hand up like this, and he said, "Yes, I want this magic. I want to make this magic. I want to make the magic of peace. I will make peace." And the whole room, it was like a Fritz Capra movie. All the kids went, "Yay!" So it was wonderful. Yeah, we want to make peace. This young man went through, I had no idea he was thinking about what I was saying and taking it seriously, but he was. He realized this was his moment to make a critical decision about the suffering he'd been through. It could kill him and destroy him, or he could make something of it, right? And he took it very seriously, and the degree of the trauma made the line very clear about what the decisions were. So and when he did that, all the younger kids were also needing an answer too, but they were much younger. They were unable to make the decision, so they looked at someone older than them to be their role model. So now there's this incredible sense in the room of, yes, this bad situation can be something wonderful, and we can be the ones who make it happen. So now I thought, okay, now we need more magic. So I said, now you've really impressed me. You've really taught me a lot about the power not only of unity, but the power of making a choice to make peace. You are some of the greatest leaders of the world, and you are going to be a great teacher one day. You'll teach children that we're all one human family, and that we have to find ways to overcome our suffering and work together. And you will be a great artist, because they had shown me in their paintings things that they'd wanted to be. So you will be a great artist, and you'll depict through beauty the wonders of life, and show how we're all united in our love of beauty. And you will be an astronaut and look down on our planet and see that it's just one home for all of us. And so I'm sort of assigning life roles for these little kids. Little Branimir, I told him, and I said, and you will be a great leader, not because you use power over people, but because you will be the best servant of others. And little Branimir's going like this, he's looking up, and all of his friends are looking at him like, Branimir, yeah, I can see Branimir being like that. So, and we thought, okay, now we need some magic. So I got the coin out again. And I said, okay, let's do this magic. So we rubbed it on everyone's stomach, and including the little kid. We didn't miss the little baby this time. Came back, and this time the coin was shaking. It had so much magic in it. And when the kids blew on it, it just disappeared. We had no idea where it went. We looked in the old lady's ear. They looked in each other's pants and each other's ears. No ring. I said, I know where it is. All this magic. You blew that right up the stairs. So we go out in the hall, running up 4 flights of stairs. All the kids are running way past me, and people looking out the doors. What's going on? We get to the top floor, and all these kids are waiting for me. And there's a clothesline with little trousers and things on them. There's a little pair of pants about that big. So I reached into the back pocket of this pair of trousers, and there was the coin. So now you use magic to try to convey universal truths. And it wasn't about magic. It's about something very real. It's about something about our nobility, something about the choice that suffering presents us with, and that we have the power and the capacity to make a choice to turn our suffering from something that paralyzes us or embitters us into something that unites us even and inspires us. It's possible. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. This story and several others like it were for me, kind of a watershed time in my own spiritual growth, because it began to show me that spiritual transformation is not about exhorting people to kindness and asking people to behave or to love each other. It's about demonstrating love, being grace, being mercy, while someone is suffering in your presence. It's about being that with others and not talking about it. And so it means that for us, the challenge is to be. Abdu'l-Baha says we must be the Lord's mercy. We must be the Lord's grace. All right? It's a whole different thing. It's a difference between giving someone a recipe for a chocolate cake and eating chocolate cake. Right? We need to be the cake, not just hand people recipes. So it's a big challenge then. And that also means we don't have to go anywhere to begin our spiritual process, because wherever we are in our life, we're already in the middle of our baking process, right? Our own lives present us with all of the stuff we need for our own transformation, all of the confusions and bitternesses and failures and mistakes and that we all make. That's the stuff of our transformation. And the first thing Abdu'l-Baha says is for us to realize that. And then he says we need to begin a process of making a struggle to make the choices that help us transform those moments. And he says we must value the struggle. He says the first thing is to value the struggle. And it's the very thing our culture tells us not to do. There's no struggle. If you're struggling, there's something probably pretty wrong with you. And I'm holier than you because I've written a book about 10 things that you can do to not have to struggle. I don't think it works that way for most people. Seems to me that, anyway, I'll come back to that in a minute. So the next thing I wanted to tell you about is what seems to be a pattern of responses to trauma. How am I doing on time? Am I good? Okay. You look bored when I'm gone too long. So, and if I'm not seeing you that you're bored, someone signal me, So that's why I'm not wearing my glasses, so I can keep talking and not have no consequence. Yeah, just the last one. Just close the doors behind you. So okay. Well, I wanted to talk to you about this is very general terms I want to give you, but I think it's kind of helpful to think about natural things that a human being does when we're faced with suffering, faced with suffering of any kind. Our brain is wired to respond to trauma. We have neural pathways in our brain that will respond to a perceived threat. It's like we have a little meter in our brain for a chemical called adrenaline, and it's down here. Well, it's like from where you're looking down here. You don't need much adrenaline, and then some threat. Let's say you're a little kid and you're running into the street after a bulb and you're playing and you're laughing, and you look up and there's a car coming at you. Well, all of a sudden your brain floods with adrenaline, and that needle goes whoop, and it flips over into the red. Okay, just like that. In fact, it happens at 1/100th of a second. It takes a neural impulse 1/10th of a second for you to realize that there's a car coming. But in 100th of a second, 10 times faster, your body has already reacted. It has already released adrenaline. Your blood vessels have already contracted to raise your blood pressure. Your respirations have already increased. Your heart is already beating faster to help you to get away from the threat. Have you heard of the fight or flight response? Have you heard that? That's what that is. It's when your body floods with adrenaline, where you either have to, so your body tenses, so you can either fight the threat or flee, get away. You either run or... and this is a really good, important survival mechanism for us. And then after the car goes by, using that analogy again, slowly that needle goes back down again. And our muscles relax and we go back to normal. But now, the next time we approach that street, our brain says, whoop, I remember what happened last time. I'm going to slow down and look both ways. So it has an educational value to us. It teaches us to look for threats. These two emotions, fear there's two basic emotions that this adrenaline can also kick in that are kind of survival emotions. They're primal emotions. And again, very simply, one of them is anger. You see the tiger coming at you, you have to get angry to fight it, or you become afraid, so you're mobilized to get out of there. So there's emotions that go with these two things. We need anger and fear. They're helpful for us as survival mechanisms. The problem is we're social animals. And so when we see threats, they're not always tigers coming at us. It might be what somebody says that we take offense at, or it might be that we feel socially uncomfortable. So we wind up responding with anger or fear when we don't need to. And so I think that this has something to do with what Abdul-Baha talks about, our lower nature. It's not that it's evil or bad. I don't think in moralistic terms like that. I just think that it's not helpful. It's unsuccessful. We are misinterpreting the world. There's a phrase Baha'u'llah used. He says, he calls these things vain imaginings. And this is my interpretation of vain imaginings, that it's the habits of thinking, habits of feeling, habits of acting that come from these lower emotions of fear or anger. Or maybe we habitually think that we're not that good of a person and people don't like us. Or we habitually think that we have the right to dominate every conversation. Or we habitually are a little bit nervous in a new environment, or, so these are habits of feeling anxious, habits of feeling afraid, habits of feeling judged, or habits of judging ourselves, maybe in very negative ways, and habits of thinking of ourselves as being inadequate. These are habits that stem from these lower emotions. Okay? It seems to me that psychologically, one of the greatest benefits of a real spiritual path is that it calms those emotions. It calms the emotions of fear and anger in particular. and releases us from the hold that those emotions have on habits of thinking, feeling, and behaving. Does that make sense? Right? So to me, what has become an interest of mine is how do we cultivate an inner life that helps us liberate ourselves from lower emotions that keep us trapped in habits of thinking about ourselves in the world, habits of feeling about ourselves in the world, and habits of acting, so that we can act with real openness with each other, see the world in a new way. Okay? So there's a real spiritual psychology, I think, in the spiritual writings of Baha'u'llah and Abdu'l-Baha in that way. There's a path of liberation, I think. What I'd like to talk about is one of these, how this fear and anger gets played out in the way we think of ourselves, our identity. And I want to take the anger side first. The research talks about this in terms of temperament. I'm going to use the language a little bit differently than what the research says. This is a good part my thinking and not entirely the research, but I think we don't have enough time to go into all the research. But there seem to be different sorts of temperaments. People who are very kind of wound up and they respond quickly to things, and people who respond less robustly to stimulation. And you could roughly say that one is more prone to responding with the primal emotion of anger, and the other is a little more prone to responding with fear, just in general. Not that they can't feel the other emotion, it's just that it's a little bit more with these two sides. Now, is this sounding too complex or too, okay? Okay. So what I wanted to go into now is talking about how these emotions affect our identity. So the first identity I want to talk about is what I call a rigid identity. And I'll give you an example of a rigid identity. Remember after 9/11, there was this initial feeling of how united we were, and that there was a sense that, we're all in this together, and that, it was visceral. I mean, I was getting emails from people all over the world in sympathy and support. And then within days, or certainly weeks, suddenly this us became us and them. We're all united, but what's wrong with you? You're not like us. And that happened in all kinds of fashions, whether it was in political parties or in racial terms or nations or communities. It became a real clear division of us and them. Well, this is one of the effects of our fear on our sense of identity. We begin to break the world up into camps. It's as if there's a big roulette wheel, with, have you seen those with the numbers? They've got the red and black numbers, and it's like, before 9/11, let's say I was a Republican and I was a Presbyterian and I was a Mason and an American, and I had all these different, a father and a brother and all these different identities. But once 9/11 happened, all of my emotional chips got put on the red 9, right? And I became hyper one thing, right? And that carried the weight of all my emotions. So if anybody offended that, the stakes for me were so high that I lashed out back at them, right? And this is a style of response, so I call it a rigid identity, where our pain shrinks our sense of identity to one thing. And that one thing might just be us, that we feel so beset, so put upon, that the smallest thing looks like a threat that threatens our very existence, right? So the smallest insult becomes something that's absolutely life-threatening, right? Or okay? So that can happen with political parties or ethnic groups or religious communities. This poor English teacher so this profoundly strong reaction to something that has a fairly simple but naive explanation, but certainly doesn't warrant a death penalty. But you have these kind of ultra hyper identifications that the responses to them are absolutist and utterly destructive. There's no middle ground. There's no black and white. There are absolute and complete destructive responses to the smallest insults. And insults are perceived everywhere. That's a rigid, I'm calling that a rigid identity. It's true in couples, in families, in companies, in communities, in religious organizations, in nations. It's a human type of response to pain. Another type of response is what I called a weakened or even a shattered identity. And that's where you don't have even the capacity to hold on to a single identity at all. And this was a lot of what I saw in work with veterans, war veterans, where the experiences were so utterly and profoundly devastating that every notion of identity was shattered, whether it was of the goodness of America or the goodness of God or the goodness of their own capacity to be good people. How could I ever be good if I've done this thing or seen this? And so what happens is a complete breakdown of a capacity to feel that you're really anything, okay? And the consequence of this, there are many, but just for time's sake, I'll just talk about one, is on motivation. Is that if you feel utterly destroyed as an individual, it's hard to mobilize yourself to any future, to see any hope that you can move towards. There's nothing we need hope. And the reason we need hope is not just for moral reasons, but we need hope because it's what organizes our inner capacities so we can move towards them and develop our capacity. So no capacity is developed. None of our potential, none of our inner nobility is developed if we don't have a vision to move towards. But that's exactly what a person who's gone through a terrible suffering often experiences, is that there is no vision, there is no hope. So there's no sense of self anymore, so there's no sense of anything to move towards. So motivation crumbles. So, and I think that we live in a world now that has a lot of both of these. We have hyper-identified individuals who are extremists of one form or another, or who feel that unless things work out exactly the way they think it, that even if it's a noble purpose, that you must be the person who made it not work, right? So that so you're the enemy. So it's an identity prone to seeing enemies, and this other response is one that just sees hopelessness and despair, and it's nihilistic. It doesn't see anything to move towards, and it's unmotivated. So we have vast numbers of people in the world right now who are so dispirited they can't motivate themselves towards anything. And on the other hand, we have extremists who are very loud, who are making it worse, who are finding ways to make victims out of these folks, or to try to bring them into their folds. This is a problem. It's a problem in families, it's a problem in communities, it's certainly a problem in the world. So again, this notion that to move past these things, we need a power in our lives that's greater than the pull of this fear and anger that holds us in these identities, right? Because that's what pain does. It holds us in our identity. And it holds us in these emotions of fear or anger. Does that make sense? So the question is, how do we escape from this gravitational, inertial pull of our own suffering that would keep us stuck in an identity that's either hopeless or rigid, right? So people will say, we just have to punch through this problem. We just have to, that kind of a, and if you're not pulling with us, you're part of the problem. And these others who's saying, what's the point? What's the point? Right? So, and that's in marriage. I mean, you don't have to look farther than a marriage. I mean, these things play out in marriages all the time. So there's a third choice, though, other than this rigid and weakened identity, and I call it a compassionate identity. But it's like this young boy was able to see that his suffering could be turned into something else. It could have a meaning, okay? Now, he'll be tested on that many, many times in his life to see if he really believes it. But the point is that there's a third choice. There's a third way to see our suffering. We can see it as a gateway to each other, as opposed to something that builds a barrier between us. We can see it as something that motivates us, as opposed to something that robs us of all motivation, right? So how do we get to there? How do we encourage that. This example I gave you of these kids in Croatia was just simply to show you that there is a choice. And it was to show you that you can make a choice in an extremely difficult situation. But the question is, how do we get there? And how do we help ourselves develop the inner tools, the inner strengths, to be able to consistently make that choice when faced with the subtle and innumerable challenges we face in day-to-day life? Well, I personally think that's the crux of every religious path, right? It's the core metaphor for all spiritual progress. And I asked Cambiz if he would help me. I wish I could show you this, but can you see this picture at all? Well, does anybody know who this is a picture of by any chance? Haji Akund. This is a very famous early Baha'i who was one of the first four hands of the cause. And there are several pictures like this of early Baha'is where they're in chains in front of these backdrops, these beautiful brocaded backdrops, where they're being tortured, but they're not behaving. They're not behaving the way they're supposed to behave. You're supposed to scream and be in agony and misery and plead for mercy when you're being tortured. But Haji Kun wasn't screaming, and he wasn't begging for mercy. He was calm, and he was frustrating his torturers. He was not behaving correctly as a prisoner. Every time there was a political upheaval in Iran, this is still true today, successive governments have blamed it on whatever the problem is on the Baha'is. So whenever there was a problem in the country or in the town that Haji Kun lived in, he would get dressed, waiting for them to come and arrest him, because he knew they were coming to beat him, and that's what happened. And so this is one of the occasions where in Tehran, when he had been tortured, and he was so impressing his torturers that they actually sent a message to the Shah and said, come and see this. This guy's, he's not a very good prisoner. He's not screaming like he's supposed to. You should see this. He's calm, and he looks like he's the king. So the Shah came down, and he said, oh, that's interesting. Well, put up a nice background and take his picture. So here's Haji Akund, and it's like an interesting dog, okay, then, and so it's just very, flippant. So there's Haji Akund in this picture with stocks around his neck, chains around his arms, and stocks on his feet. It's the other way around. Actually, he has chains on his feet, chains on his neck, and stocks on his hands. And he's sitting on this chair like a throne with this background, and he looks utterly peaceful. What a mystery is that? And there's other pictures of Ibn Abhar, another one of the hands of the cause, in this exact same situation with chains around his neck, chains around his feet. He looks blissful. And you see Varga and his son, 9-year-old son, same radiant countenance after they're being tortured. Now, there's a way to look at that as a form of heroism, which I think is valid. But for me, it's another question, is how can we see that response to real physical, grotesque torture and suffering, and see their response as a metaphor for us when we face the tortures of our own lives? How can I become that peaceful in the face of my own suffering? That, to me, is the spiritual question. I don't care what you believe in about the nature of God or the nature of the Trinity or any. Those things, to me, are irrelevant. To me, they're interesting. But what's really interesting is I want some of that. I want that. Right? How do I get there? So, okay. Would you like to see the picture? Should I pass it around? It seems to me we have to find a way to re-identify who we are. We have to find a way to see ourselves in a way that transcends, that is grounded in, but also transcends at the same time our experience. All right, what does that mean? Let me read one of Baha'u'llah's hidden words. It's a wonderful book. It's a series of very short passages that Baha'u'llah revealed when he walked the banks of the Tigris in the years before his public declaration of his mission. And Baha'u'llah says that this book contains the essence of all that was revealed to all of the previous religions. So it's a very interesting book. It's the sort of thing you read each of these passages over and over, and through your life you find that they unfold meanings, like over and over and deeper levels of meaning. So here's one of these hidden words, and this is as if God is speaking to us. That's the voice with which these are spoken. O son of utterance, thou art my stronghold. Enter therein, that thou mayest abide in safety. Enter therein, enter yourself, that thou mayest abide in safety. My love is in thee, know it, that thou mayest find me near unto thee. Know it. Don't say you believe in it. Don't say you want to tell other people that it's there. Know that love. And I think he's asking us to know it more than intellectually, but know it to the level that we can be in the state that Haji Akund was in the midst of our suffering. When our suffering pulls us, when we're in an argument with our spouse, it pulls us to anger, or it pulls us to hopelessness and despair. Know it then, and plant little flags in our hearts and our minds to remind us to go back to that sense of knowing, so that we can transform the bitterness of a moment in our own family into something that's transformative. See, this is, I think, really the crux of, for me, what seems to me to be the spiritual path. There's a wonderful series. Oh, you know what, Gilbert? Here, I closed the book after. Gilbert showed me this quote, and now I see 141, and then okay, there we go. Thank you. It seems to me in the Baha'i writings too, it talks about this capacity to move from this lower nature of our suffering, our sense of fear or anger, and there's many other emotions, but I'm just staying with those two for tonight. To let go of those, we have to have a larger motivation, something else that we value more. And that, Abdul-Baha tells us over and over again, is love. We need to find within ourselves a wellspring of love that is more real to us than the texture of our anger or the seduction of our fear. Okay? These seductive emotions that pull us into all kinds of self-righteous justifications for what we're doing. Every person who's ever been angry at anyone has a perfectly good reason. It's just not helpful. Right? It's always a good reason. It's just not helpful. So it's a trap. It's a trap that keeps us in these lower identities where we feel more and more isolated. So how do we nurture this sense of love within ourselves? This, to me, I think, winds up being the most critical spiritual question. That's the engine. And all of the great founders of all the world's religions have been the embodiment of this love to their followers, right? And they've taught us ways to approach this love in ways where we can transform this pain, this lower nature, this sinful self, whatever you want to call it, the Maya, the Hindus describe, or to be able to walk the Dharma, as the Buddhists describe, to feed that sense of ourselves that has a compassionate heart. All right. Abdul-Baha talks about this in one level, is talking about sacrifice, that we need to sacrifice the lower conditions for the higher conditions. And I think this is what he's talking about. And one of the things he's most certainly referring to, is these poles of our strong emotions, especially fear and anger. There's others. There's despair, and there's jealousy, and there's envy. These are also very potent emotions that pull us into an identification. Abdu'l-Baha says that these passions, if they become the dominant note in our lives, destroy us. Right? And he says one strong emotion leads to another. So our hatred, or our anger turns to hatred, which turns into self-loathing, because we don't want to hate someone else. So we loathe ourselves. So we feel despair. So we feel angry at the people who made us get into this in the first place. And then we feel, see, it's a circle. The one emotion keeps falling into another one, and we become trapped in the circle of these emotions. So what Abdu'l-Baha is describing to us is a release from that. He says, let go of those things. Developing the capacity to let go of a strong emotion, we need to realize that that's a task, that we need to strengthen our ability to do that. Because if we don't, we are trapped by these emotions, and they define us, and they rob us of our higher nature. And that which helps us overcome these things is love. And we need to find as many ways to reinforce love in each other as possible. These beautiful, beautiful tasks that the Universal House of Justice has set before the Baha'is, I think it's helpful to look at them in that light, to see these devotional gatherings as generators of love that melt away and burn away all of these veils of difference and separation, that help feed that sense of vision in us. These devotionals are extremely important community generators. You can even think of them as a primary means for the development of culture in a community, because it mobilizes that sense of unity that's based on our nobility, right? And if it's based on our nobility and not just what we say we believe, but based on something that is really at the heart of our capacity to love, if it's based there, then we're building in each other and strengthening each other the capacity to withstand these strong emotions of fear and anger and these other things. The same is true for our children's classes and for the other core activities for the junior youth and for the institute process. I think it's important to look at these things as important organs in the development of the body of the community. That with these things together comprise the basic building blocks, the bowl that you might say that holds this living capacity to transform suffering into light and into nobility. The suffering of this 14-year-old didn't go away when he made that choice. It didn't go away. But it looked different to him. And because it looked different to him because he had made a choice, he now could mobilize strengths he didn't know he had to deal with his suffering instead of feeling passive by the overwhelming nature of what had happened to him, or to be consumed by rage to seek vengeance.